Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Oh, good. We've got a lot of folks coming in. It's just about 9, and we'll wait a few minutes to let everyone in the room. Are we all in, Jesse? Okay. Well, welcome, everyone. While you're here, why don't you share in the chat box where you're currently from and what you're hoping to learn from this workshop. We're glad you're here with us.
Cynthia O'Malley from Trinity Church, Newport, Rhode Island. And this is my first time at SEEP, so I'm learning everything about everything. It's been great. I'm really enjoying it. I'm just looking forward to our session.
Thank you, Cynthia. All right. Phoenix. Chicago. Hello, fellow Chicagoans. I'm also in Chicago, Tennessee, Boston, Canada, Arizona, Maryland, North Carolina. Wow, this is really cool. Okay, well, it looks like we're pretty full. So I think I'll go ahead and get us going for the sake of time. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stewardship for a Changing Landscape. My name is TJ Houlihan. I'm a member of the SEEP Planning Committee, and thank you all for being here with us virtually. It's an interesting conference gathering, and I'm glad to have you all with us. I serve on the presiding bishop staff in the Episcopal Church Office of Development, so I am a full-time development professional, and I'm very eager to learn from our two wonderful presenters. This is going to be a great session. Before we get into this, I just want to say David King is going to lay some foundation of what's been happening in the last year or so, and then Christine Miller is going to share with us some actionable ways that we can address what's going on. So it's going to seem like there's a lot of information at you at once, but I want you to know to stick with us. It's great information to have and to learn from and build on, and then you're going to hear some ways that you can work through this. A few housekeeping details. If there's any tech issues, please note them in the chat box. We have just an hour together, so we're going to have our presentation for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be Q&A. And so when we come to that, please put your questions in the chat box as well, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to them, we will follow up. So please know that we'll get to everyone. This is being recorded, so you can come back and refer to this again, and the slides will be available and they'll be put up on this session up on the Whova platform. Let me just introduce our presenters quickly. Christine Miller is a partner and executive vice president with Horizon Stewardship, a holistic generosity consulting firm. For over 20 years, Christine has consulted with churches and faith-based nonprofits to create strategies and processes that create deeper connections and grow giving. And our other presenter, David King, is the Karen Lake Buttry Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, as well as Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies within the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He spends the bulk of his time working with congregations around issues of stewardship, generosity, and economics. David was trained as an American religious historian, is a published author, and an ordained minister in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. He's a frequent speaker and teacher in local congregations, theological schools, nonprofits, and across philanthropy. He is passionate about research and teaching and fueled by facilitating conversations with faith leaders, donors, and fundraisers of all generations around the intersections of faith and giving. Welcome, Christine and David.
Thanks, TJ. It's great to be here. Great to work with Christine and to see all you here as well. I'm going to share a few slides with you this morning and talk you through a bit about what we know around faith and giving, and then think particularly as we've moved into this past year, the unique situation, circumstances we found ourselves in, and then focus particularly on donors. And Christine will really work with us as well as thinking about what we do as leaders in this space and thinking around new change in economic models, fundraising, and working across our communities. So if we can go ahead and start sharing our screen, we'll look at sort of a few things here. And I'm glad to share these slides with you, so don't worry about trying to jot too much down, and we'll work through that as well. And so just to tell you a bit about who we are at Lake Institute, we've really been focused at the School of Philanthropy on faith and giving for almost 20 years now. Across faith communities. If you skip ahead to the next slide, talk about Lake Institute, and then even to the next slide as well. So we really focused in on three areas: research and scholarship, education and training, and then public understanding. So when we focus in on education and training, many of you have worked with us in the past here at SEAT and other places as we focus on our executive certificate in religious fundraising, which is part of our work focused in on religious leaders, focusing on their development as fundraisers. We've also oftentimes worked through congregations, working through congregational teams, through our congregation, sort of cultivate. Where I want to focus with you a bit today is on our research and scholarship and on the landscape of giving. But we focus particularly in recent years on congregations, partly because we don't know much about congregational finances, because it's a bit of a black box among other nonprofits, because like all other nonprofits in many ways that file 990s with the IRS, congregations very rarely do. And so we don't actually know about how money comes in, how it's managed, and then how it's spent. And economic practices, I know it's a mouthful, NSCEP, and we can skip ahead a few slides when we're ready. We focused in on how that money comes in, how it's managed, how we talk about stewardship and generosity, and keep going a couple more slides and we'll be good. And then most recently, we did this in 2017, 2018. We focused in on a COVID-19 congregational study in particular. So if you skip ahead once more. We focused in this past September, publishing data that we have around giving in particular during COVID. And so this is important because we were able to get data from February through July into August about what was happening with congregational giving in the midst of the pandemic. And so we were able to 700-800 congregations across the country. I want to move ahead to the next slide, where I'm going to give you just a picture and go ahead one more slide about the landscape of religious giving. So just to set our context, we know, and this is data from Giving USA that many of you are familiar with, giving continues to grow. And so the most recent data we have from 2019, we'll have 2020 data just here in the next few months, is that giving has been up slightly, around 4%. A lot of that comes from individual giving, even as we think about those major donors, McKinsey, Scott, Bezos, Gates, etc. Religious giving has grown just a slight bit, about a wash once you account for inflation. But the important thing to note is religious giving is held steady, maybe grown slightly, but does trail the growth of giving overall. So in essence, religious giving is losing market share. However, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that religious giving continues to make up the vast majority of giving in America. It's the largest sector by far at 29%, which is double the second highest sector, like education. So the good news and the bad news. religious giving is by far the biggest subsector of charitable giving in the United States. The bad news, if you go to the next slide, is that it's really decreased in its market share over the course of the last 20, 30 plus years. So this slide will tell you a bit about in 5-year increments from as far as we've been tracing since the 1980s, let's say, until this past year. In the 80s, religious giving made up close to or over 50% of all giving in America. And that's down to about 30% over this past year. So what we're seeing is the shrinking piece of the pie that religious giving makes up. And that matters for us as leaders in congregations because that religious giving, the definition of religious giving is mostly focused in on congregations, denominations, missionary societies. So what that number basically is, for the most part, is congregational giving. Congregations, over 300,000 of them, dotting almost every community in the country, but giving to those congregations is changing. Why is it changing? Well, a couple guesses. On the next slide, you can see from some of our most recent, the Pew studies, PRRI and other places, you'll note that the sort of religious affiliation is declining. There's a growing number of nothing in particulars, spiritual but not religious, or the nones. And so just to note, the largest percentage of decline is in the broader Christian affiliation patterns. And so you'll see that probably that rise of disaffiliation is important. You also see there on this slide that there's a declining number of giving households. So fewer people are giving. And so fewer people are giving more. That allows giving to grow. It's skewing towards maybe the larger donors. Think about the headlines from the past year around Mackenzie Scott, for instance, and other big donors. But the number of people who are giving something each year is declining. And we know the bread and butter of giving to congregations are average, repetitive type of giving. So that might be a major impact. One other thing we might look at on the next slide is that there are just a growing number of nonprofits and NGOs that are competing with congregations and other faith-based nonprofits for their gifts. And like we mentioned before, with the definition of religious giving being quite narrow, not including things like Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Charities, World Vision, etc. All those massive, big and small nonprofits are included here in this nonprofit NGO category and are oftentimes better at and are also competing alongside your donors in your congregations for their charitable donations. So let's shift and look a bit more at congregations specifically. If we go to the next slide, we can see that what we do know through all of this giving literature is that people of faith give more often, they give larger amounts, they volunteer more, and it's giving and volunteering to both religious and secular causes. So of course, giving would and volunteering would happen within congregations, let's say, but also specifically to all types of causes. So faith as a motivator, whether it's affiliation, attendance patterns, intensity of religious practices and beliefs matter in giving. So you can see from the next slide that even if we look at not thinking about the difference between an evangelical and an Episcopalian, a Methodist and a Mennonite, if you just look at if you have a religious affiliation, you on average as an individual will give twice as much as someone without an affiliation, which I think is an amazing asset for us in positions of religious leadership within congregations to see that as a motivating factor for why people give. And it's something that we have to tap into to be able to sort of nurture. It's so important. So we move to the next slide, and you can just skip ahead one more to looking at what's happening in congregations. So this is foundational data from our INSEP study that makes the point that congregations' revenue, what comes in finances for congregations, is coming from individual donations. So over 80% of all revenue for congregations comes in through passing the plate, let's say. There's small percentages from endowment, from rental, sales, other types of fundraisers, but it's really individual giving that makes the big difference. If you go to the next slide, you can see that that individual giving most often happens in worship services, passing the plate. Over that course of the weekend of services, 78% of congregations receive that 81% of individual giving. So what's important to think about there when our congregations, very few of us have been meeting in person together over the last almost year, is how have we shifted the mentality around most of our givers who oftentimes are giving in regular ways in sort of the culturated patterns of giving. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that most congregations have forms of digital giving. And about a fourth of congregations received giving digitally, and about another quarter actually of those folks gave digitally. That number has continued to grow and has risen to almost all congregations over the past year, right? So over 90% of congregations, over 100 members, have some forms of digital giving. You can see there continues to be digital divides here. Smaller congregations, more financially strapped congregations, those who skew in older demographics really are struggling through the midst of this pandemic because of some of the lacks of access to those digital forms. But that's one of the biggest keys of how things have changed in the last year, is how we've all become more and more aware of how to engage people in giving digitally. So if we go to our next slide, you can see that that the patterns of asking are also sort of rooted into our cultures. Really only half or less than half of congregations conduct an annual stewardship campaign. What we're completely used to in many of our congregations in the fall, beginning to ask people to pledge, have a stewardship series, that is maybe not necessarily the norm for all congregations. And particularly as we're experiencing disruption in the work that we're doing around stewardship and generally across our congregations, this might be a time to think about, what do people expect from us, and how have some of those expectations changed? Where are we able, for instance, to try a few things new, even with living into some of those patterns of pledging, for instance, that we're used to? If we go to the next slide, just another point to make clear that teaching about giving is completely aligned with giving. So very rarely, much less, clergy are basically talking or preaching about giving less than once a quarter. Most often it happens once or twice a year, and typically it's in that fall stewardship season that we would expect it. And the time that people expect you to talk about giving is the time they're most inclined not to listen to you talk about giving, because they know what you're going to say before you say it. So thinking about how you teach, not just in the pulpit, but how are you doing that through all your forms of communication, connection through stories, testimonies, etc., helps shape connected to your giving. So I want to shift gears a bit as we move to the next slide and tell you about some of what we've been learning from our actual study of congregations in the midst of the COVID crisis. So we did a study across all sort of a wide diversity of congregations across the country, looking at how the pandemic was affecting not only how they were receiving money, but how they were looking to the future. So we caught most congregations 6 months or so into the pandemic. So in the last half of 2020, how they were thinking about what was coming and how they were looking to planning for this year, current 2021. So if we shift to that next slide, you can see that patterns of giving and participation was up for a majority of congregations, probably because we were counting things strangely, with streaming services and online connection points. But giving actually for us was not as bad as many might have thought. So while 40% of congregations saw a decline in their giving, that means 59% were holding steady or even reporting some growth. So particularly in those first months of the pandemic, congregations were able to rally. They were able to sort of shift gears and hold steady. And I think what we've been seeing through the end of 2020, although we don't have lots and lots of data here yet, you might be able to tell us, just as we're thinking about it together, many congregations did okay. If we go to that next slide, you can see that it was pretty steady across religious traditions. broken down, let's say, across mainline Catholic, evangelical as an example. On the right, you can see year-over-year data. We asked for actual data from 2019, month to month from 2020. And over that span from February through June, congregational giving was down about 4.4%. So there was decline, but and that's year-over-year data. And it looks different for different types of congregations. Catholics, for instance, did quite worse than other groups, but it's important to note sort of where that shift was happening. I want to point you to 2 or 3 other things before we shift gears. And on the next slide, you can see we asked them what was their response, how they were responding during the pandemic. It's not news that the payroll protection program, the PPP loans, were super important for many congregations. And over 60% of congregations in our sample applied and received one of those loans. The larger congregations that had a bit more expertise and experience, that number was even higher. So there was a lot of diversity as far as small congregations finding it more difficult, thinking about congregations with denominational connections where maybe the Episcopal Foundation or your diocese or other, et cetera, groups could help, made a big difference. Much less personnel issues as far as furloughing or laying off staff, much more sort of pulling back on administrative expenses. But one thing I really found helpful was that 30% of congregations were helping other congregations or nonprofits. So there was some paying forward type of work that I think has oftentimes been missed in some of the stories we've been telling about the pandemic. But on the next slide, you'll see, despite those shifts in what's happening in the midst of the pandemic, as congregations were looking forward in the last half of 2020 and to the first of 2021, no congregation said that they were going to increase their budget over this next year. The majority said they were going to hang on and keep things flat. So as Christine will talk to us a bit more about in the next part of our presentation, what does that say about how we're leading into our congregations? Many of them probably were hoping to hold flat, which was probably a positive, but few probably were making too much of where were they going to cut, where were they going to grow. They were just going to hold things steady. That seems to be the modus operandi of churches. So we're going to kind of keep things steady and hope for the best. When we asked them to look forward into that next year, if things continued throughout the pandemic, on the next slide, you can see that many of them were beginning to think even more about new fundraising appeals. How were they going to be able to move that needle with new ask? They were going to begin to draw down reserves. They were going to continue to cut administrative expenses. And finally, we asked them on the slide that you've got there in front of you now, in a different study where we just focused on leaders, congregational as well as nonprofit leaders, what were the big leadership challenges that they were experiencing over this past year? And about a third, nearly 30%, said they were just kind of hoping to hang on, hoping that by the next year they could find some stability to return to normal, so to speak. But the majority, in some form or fashion, were hoping for something new. They were hoping for some kind of a reset or growth or innovation. And those kinds of hopeful new ideas, I think, really sparked interest for us. And seeing this maybe as a turning point, and this was early in the pandemic, for not simply returning to the way things have always been done, but using this as a leverage point, a turning point to think about the next economic models, the work and ministry of the church. And when we asked them what some of those kinds of change looked like, it was reimagining the use of their current resources, helping to serve and engage in their communities in different ways, innovating on how they ask and talked about money and ministry, and then the unique challenges of managing change in organizations as complex as congregations. I want to say just one point about donors in particular. So if we can move through the next 2 slides to the one more that talks about nurturing givers. We've done I've told you a lot about congregations. I want to focus in on donors. We've done studies at the School of Philanthropy on high net worth donors for a number of years. And these changes, I think, apply to all donors. But what big change we've seen over the past decade is a sense of giving out of obligation and duty, giving back to your community, continuing to support the same causes year over year. That's a lot like many people give to congregations, right? But in the past few years, we've been seeing much more of a focus on engaging out of passion and personal satisfaction, making a difference. The motivations have shifted towards alignment with values and vision individually with the organizations they support. But many of our congregations, we still speak out of that sense of duty and obligation, sort of continuing to do the same each year. And if you go to that next slide, one of the important sort of disconnects that I continue to see in this research is that when we look at motivations, it's all about personal values and interests and experience. But when we look at the challenges that donors record about what their challenges are in thinking about their giving, 67% have a challenge or concern about identifying what they care about. So here's the disconnect. 3/4 of donors want to give out of a sense of values and connection, but 2/3 of those same donors struggle with knowing what their values are. They don't talk to their family about these things either. So who better to ask questions, discerning questions with donors about their values and what they care about and what meaning making is happening through their giving than us as religious leaders embedded within congregations. And so if you go to that next slide, you'll see, I would encourage you, and I know Christine will walk us through some of these same kinds of things. How can we ask questions of our donors, not asking them just for a gift, but asking them to discern their values, thinking to help them with their own moral imaginations, thinking about their stories and legacies. These are the kinds of questions that we're equipped to ask. We have open space to engage with donors on, and they hopefully are expecting it from us. And that's the kind of work that can nurture donors in new ways to find alignment with the kind of work that we're doing. And I want to turn it over to Christine now to help us think a bit more about how to do that with our congregation.
So thank you, David. Thanks for that overview. Justy, we're just going to keep rolling from David's last slide, hopefully, and keep moving. Just to kind of give a recap about David's research, and I love research, maybe not as much as David, but I do love the research very much. Just to kind of recap and some of the things that keep me up at night, number of donors is going down. Overall, the number of donors is going down, and giving to religious organizations is going down as a percent of the total charitable pie. So this creates a lot of challenges for us. Then you throw on top of it that 78% of giving actually happens during worship. That's a scary proposition for those of us who haven't been in worship much, if at all, during the past year. And then just historically, what we have done with our charitable giving within our churches is to use kind of archaic methods where we rely on obligation, commitment, annual pledging, and things of that sort to encourage and engage donors, when in fact that's not really working for us. And then the increasing number of nonprofits who are doing an exceptional job, many of them, to engage our donors in giving. So all of these create some serious angst for us. So Jesse, are we able to get that presentation back up? Okay, no worries. I'm just going to keep rolling. Give you some ideas of what can you do with all of this, and how can you address. And it seems to me that we need to be able to engage donors in different ways. And as we said, primarily and historically, we've been using that pledge campaign to engage donors, and it's a one and done. We don't typically see a lot of churches engaging donors in between the season of pledging. And, just a side note, David mentioned about the fall season. Although we are canonically obligated as Episcopal churches to keep our fiscal years, the annual year, January to December, that does not mean that you can't move your pledging process to a spring season. This webinar right now are doing their annual stewardship effort in the spring season during Lent season very well. And so I encourage you to think about that as part of your changing ways in which you're engaging donors. So with all of the research that's out there, we're going to have to work really hard at engaging our donors. It's not getting any easier, I'm sorry to say. But if we do the right things and if we do engage our donors in meaningful ways, I do think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and there is funding to do all that God is calling you to do. So over the past several months, I've interviewed several of our church leaders, Episcopal church leaders, and try to find out, what are they seeing and what are they doing that's effective? And so in these conversations, several ideas emerged, and I want to kind of talk you through those. The first is around technology. And of course, technology has been both our friend and our enemy during these past several months. But mostly, technology has enabled us to continue to do ministry, to continue to be in conversation with our members, and to continue to provide excellent worship. So the first thing about technology in terms of giving is these what I call giving portals. As David said, prior to the pandemic, a good number of churches were at least beginning to dabble in giving online. And that escalated like many things did during the pandemic. But one thing that I'm seeing is that churches figure, well, if we've got giving on our website set up, that's great, we're done, because we've given people one way to make their contributions. And I want to encourage you to think about that it's not really about the church's how the donor wants to give and how the donor wants to give and when the donor wants to give. So we're going to talk a bit about that in a second. The other piece about technology is about wealth screening. Nonprofits have been doing this for years, and some of our larger churches are beginning to do it. And wealth screening allows you to understand more about your donor's capacity, about their other interests, what other charities that they contribute to besides yours. And it helps you to engage donors in real, authentic conversations about previously, knowing what donors care about and is incredibly valuable and important to us. Analytics is software that provides real-time data and information about your donors so that you can do actionable steps to either or even to acknowledge a first-time donor to offer gratitude and thanks. So let me dive into each of those just a little bit more. Giving portals. Again, it's just not about how the church wants to receive the gift. It's really about how the donor wants to make the gift. And so if you think from that point of view, it's using every single piece of technology at our disposal to make sure that we provide the donor various options for making those contributions. In 2020, I contributed to about 25 churches across the country. And as we do this as part of what we call our next level generosity discovery. And I learned a lot about how churches are engaging their donors in an online digital way. And when you look at if you actually go through the process as if you are a donor, you'll find that you have all kinds of different obstacles potentially in the way of enabling that donor to make that gift in a timely manner. So I highly encourage you to take a look at the ways that you're inviting donors to give digitally to you, test them out to see if they work, and test them out to make sure that they're smooth and obstacle free. And again, some churches feel as if once they've set up their website to receive online giving, then they're done. And I want to warn you that you're not. Donors want to give in a variety of different ways, and it's up to the church to make that possible for them. It's all about how those donors want to contribute. It also means providing an opportunity for the offering during worship. I know, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, I had several churches that said they felt that it was not appropriate to include the offertory or include an offertory on their online worship streaming experience. I encourage you, if you're still in that mindset, watch some of your colleagues and their worship experiences, and they will show you it's really, really important. One of the people that I spoke to is Rich Webster, who's the rector at St. Luke's in Birmingham, Alabama. And he remarked that it's really an important thing to include the offertory moment and to provide time during the offertory for people who are watching online to make that gift, because it is something that offers them a sacramental moment during the worship experience. So even if your donors are online, they can experience that sacramental opportunity if you provide them the time and space in which to do that. Wealth screening. Wealth screening, again, is something that many of our nonprofit friends have been doing for many, many years. It uses publicly available data. So you're not doing anything too covert here, but you're using publicly available data to learn more about your donors. We have a product called CPI, which stands for Capacity, Propensity, and Interest, which allows you to understand more about the affinities that your donors have for other kinds of organizations and how you might engage them in some of the visioning that you have by knowing what they're passionate about. As I'm going to talk in a minute about the importance of the rector's role in all of this. And this is one of the ways that you can create some efficiencies in working with your donors, because the more you know about donors, the more that you can engage them in meaningful conversations about their giving. So wealth screening, again, uses public data. It allows you to invite donors into conversations that are about their passions. And it also helps you to identify even prospective planned giving donors. We have a lot of donors who are perhaps great planned giving potential prospects. Many of our churches are trying to find out who those people are, and a wealth screen can enable you to do that fairly efficiently. So analytics, again, is becoming much more popular with churches because it provides data that's actionable. So we partner with a couple of companies. One is called Mortarstone, and the other is called Tools for Church. And Tools for Church is, again, one of our analytics partners. What they help you do is to identify, again, in real time, how your donors are giving, what are their giving behaviors, and provides you some actionable steps. So for example, you have someone who's made a first-time contribution. Sometimes that's takes days or even weeks for that information to get to the rector's desk. First-time donors, 2 out of 3 people make a first-time gift and never make a second. And part of the reason is that they're testing to see what that relationship is going to be like by making that first time gift. So finding ways to quickly and efficiently respond to those first time donors can help you to retain that donor and increase the lifetime value of that donor to the church. So analytics gives you great data that helps you make actionable strategies that you can act on immediately and engage your donors more quickly. I want to spend just a minute talking about relationships. Personal, authentic relationships really are the key to every single type of giving. And primarily that relationship is with the rector. So, the rector's involvement is so important. And I know all of you may be having a deep sigh right now, because I know how busy you are. One of the people that I interviewed actually suggested the role of the rector was so vital to the conversations with donors that rather than not doing it, he suggested that you try to find ways to eliminate other things, to give them to someone else to do if possible, so that you have the bandwidth to engage with donors. One of the people that I follow a lot in his research is Adrian Sargent, who's formerly with the Indiana School of Philanthropy, but he's now the co-director of the Institute of Sustainable Philanthropy. And he says, everything we know about how to build a good relationship as a parent or a friend, we can apply to fundraising. So think about that. For example, you would never write your grandmother a thank you note and address it, to your parish family. And yet many of our churches are still not personalizing the letters that they're sending to people who consider themselves as part of our family. So make sure when you're communicating with your donors that you're making it as personal as possible and talking to them in a way that really reflects the depth of that relationship. Another fundraiser that I follow quite a lot is Penelope Burke, and she's coined a term donor-centric. And her research focuses primarily on donors, not on nonprofits or churches, but on the donors themselves. And she's had conversations and had surveyed hundreds of thousands of donors over the years. And she talks about being able to connect on a more personal level with the people that fund our ministries and provide them what they want in return, which is actually fairly few and far between. I see somebody's putting in the chat about donor-centric fundraising. She's written a couple of books in that regard, and I highly commend them to you. I love the research she's done and refer to it often. So building relationships and the rector's role in that cannot be underestimated. It's just crucial. And knowing your donors well creates an opportunity to connect with them where they are, wherever that is in their giving and in their philanthropy, to engage them in meaningful conversations around their passions and interests. Relationships can take place in a variety of different kinds of donors. First of all, financial leaders. You have people in your congregations who are heavily invested in your ministries. These people are at the top of your giving list, and they require your personal attention. They have, by their giving, communicated to you that your ministry means something to them, and they want to be in a deeper relationship. So acknowledging that relationship and deepening that relationship is critical. You also probably have some high capacity donors who may or may not show up at the top of your giving list. So finding ways, as David mentioned earlier, to have conversations with them. Most of these people have gotten where they are because they're really smart or really creative or all of the above. And so invite them into the conversations and ask for their wisdom. Ask them about their own personal experiences. Many of those entrepreneurs have had a really rugged 2020. So ask them, what keeps you up at night? What kinds of problems are you experiencing in your life? And have those meaningful and pastoral kinds of conversations with them. And again, you might also invite them to help you solve some problems. Here, I've got this problem. I know that you've been in business for umpteen million years. Help me to resolve this problem or think about this problem a little differently. Invite them into that. And then again, the relationship with first-time givers. The first-time givers often are testing to see how you're going to respond and how you can encourage that donor to continue to be a part of your ministry and investing more deeply in it. The last idea that really kept emerging from these conversations was this idea of having a vision. I wondered when I read David's research, what it means when not a single congregation in the study, the COVID-19 study, planned to increase its budget for 2021? What does that suggest to our donors about mission? It's really difficult to make a case to a donor to increase giving when your budget remains flat. If you're going to do what you did last year, why should I grow in giving to you as an organization? So having a big vision, something that really people can sink their teeth into and really get excited about. Many churches are not dreaming real big right now. And I think that our donors are sensing that we don't have big dreams. We don't have God-sized vision. And I encourage you to find one if you don't have one, and articulate it often and well to your donors. In one of these conversations, one of the priests told me about a conversation he was having with a donor and asking her to consider, a 6-figure contribution to the capital campaign. And she turned and asked him, what makes you think that we're going to be here in 30 or 40? We didn't used to have to defend that as a church, but I think particularly now since COVID, we really do have to defend that. How do we know? What is our vision? Or how are we going to continue to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world in the next 30, 40, or 50 years? The other piece about big vision is finding ways to share that with others who can become advocates and supporters. You don't have to. In fact, you really shouldn't try to do it alone. You have many supporters and people with capacity to help those visions become reality. I also spent some time interviewing Chuck Treadwell, who's at St. David's in Austin, and he talked about the importance of sharing that powerful vision to attract and retain donors. And he says that the church needs to be jazzed up about the love of God and doing things that matter, not just about getting the social ills right, but about living a Jesus-centered life. And he says people and their giving are attracted to large initiatives with a big vision. And he also kind of channeled Bishop Curry when he said, anger doesn't nearly have the staying power that love has. And he says we need to focus first on getting people to follow the way of love. And by doing so, we have a better chance of getting those social ills right. So finding a way to find that large vision and to articulate it in meaningful ways will help your donors become more jazzed up about the love of God and hopefully encourage them to be more inclined to support your important ministry. I think that's about all I have, except to remind people to, if you have not yet done so, come visit Horizon's booth and enter our raffle. We are giving away what we call a next level generosity discovery. It's a deep dive into all the ways in which you're engaging your donors into the relationship to find things that we can celebrate in ways that you're doing and maybe help you to implement some other best practices. So I encourage you to get on our website and take a look at that, or get in our booth. So I think we now are going to go to some questions and answers. And TJ, do you have questions from the?
I do, thank you. And I realize our time is coming to an end, so I'm trying to pick and choose through some of these. Danielle Dunbar wants to learn more about diverse income streams, especially earned income or fee for service. What can we spend time on outside of annual stewardship to grow our income? Are there good examples?
Yeah, David, you're on mute, so I want you to jump in if you want to say something. Did you have something you want to respond to?
Just to say one thing and turn it back to you, Christine, is, I think this is, I think doing it, exploring it with sophistication makes sense, but also aligned with mission. So, just trying to find ways to rent out extra space in your building just to make money doesn't seem to be the right move. I think it should be mission centered, as Christine pointed us to. And I think this actually brings a lot of interesting people, the kinds of leaders that Christine pointed you to, who are entrepreneurial or have financial gifts as far as management, to help you think about these things together. I would do that alongside more actual theological reflection. So thinking about your endowment, for instance, many congregations are thinking about their assets around questions of deep response to issues like reparations or reconciliation, or taking pieces of their endowment beyond just whatever average 5% return that they might want to invest to make a big gift in their community. Maybe that's a gift that comes back to them, with lower interest because it's mission centered. But I think it's both a theological conversation and a sort of sophisticated one. Not simply, and again, this is not crass, don't mean it this way, but this is not a money grabber, ways to build your budget. But it is, I think, a mission-centered conversation, but I think a key one for the church to reflect on these next few years.
And I might also add, if you would like to add a pop-up to the community section of the app, that might be a great place to gather other folks who have similar questions about how to grow those revenue streams in their parish. Christine, lots of questions here about wealth screening. Learning more about wealth screening, I'd like to learn more. How do I approach people with the results? Engage in the screenings, especially for smaller parishes. What kind of resources are there?
Yeah. So there's, I'm happy to answer those questions. Just send me an email and we can talk through kind of what that looks like. It's not hugely expensive. So even for fairly small congregations, it's not super expensive. And we offer coaching through that so that you can begin to understand what the data is saying and how to approach various donors and have those conversations. And again, we're not necessarily going to our donors and saying, hey, you showed up high on the wealth screen, and so I just wanted to have coffee with you today. Those aren't the kinds of conversations that we're having, hopefully. But it does help you to be more efficient in how you're spending your time in cultivating some of those high capacity donors. And I know many of you have experienced that those donors that come into your office that are usually the ones that give you the most headaches typically aren't those people that are at the top of your giving list. It's usually the very quiet, cooperative ones that are the ones who have the greatest potential. And but finding out what else they contribute to and know a bit about their capacity enables you to have a more meaningful conversation with them. So if you're interested in wealth screens, shoot me an email and we can have conversation about that.
Thanks, Christine. Jillian asked, what's a go-to resource to help people become jazzed up and move away from a scarcity mindset?
Wow, that's a whole webinar right there, I think, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd begin with the resource of prayer, honestly. I think that, I've asked many churches, what's your God-sized vision for ministry? And I've had, everything from, well, we'd really like to pave the parking lot to, something really big and God-sized. So to enable your people to really think big, it's hard. It's really hard work, but I would start with inviting God into that conversation. So David, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's right. But I think making sure these are theologically and spiritually framed conversations is key. And I think there's so much that we can do there to not sort of disconnect the money conversation from the rest of the work out there.
Got a few comments here that folks might find helpful on the relationship building. Julia Alling says, in your database, add an attribute for pronunciation of donors' names. Write it phonetically in the field. You can learn pronunciation from voicemail outgoing messages, and asking it will improve the next call if you get the name right. Pam Gomez, now's a great time for planned giving as people are taking care of details since they aren't traveling. Some things to keep in mind.
That's a great comment, Pam. And there's also, a lot of research suggesting that people are focusing on planned giving right now, not because they're not traveling so much, but because COVID really brought that sense of reality to people's lives. So she's absolutely on track with that.
David, I see you just posted a great resource in the chat box. We'll make sure folks get the link to that. Let's see, we might have time for one more question here. Kurt asks, how to best balance the parish requests of parishioners to donate for annual pledges, building campaigns, and endowments?
Well, Christine can speak to this directly too, but I think one thing that I was really struck by in Christine's own suggestions to us around digital giving, these giving portals, just because you've put something on your website to say you can give here doesn't mean that works for people. And so I feel the same way about a diversity of ask. And so I think, having clearly ways for people to pledge and make those regular gifts, but also making clear that, here's the sort of the what we call the four-legged stool of fundraising, and thinking about that annual giving, whether there's the capital campaign, there's the quest and plan giving. So to think about the diversification of those revenue streams, not being shy to ask about them, but being carefully, thoughtful as far as how you space those out and how you're languaging those letters, as Christine has already pointed us to.
And I think that what we're learning, or we should be learning, is that one size does not fit all. Every giver in your congregation has specific ways and interests that they want to make their contribution to your ministry. So I think that, again, this is part of why the relationship is so important and why it's so challenging, is because donors are looking for a very personalized approach from nonprofits and also from us. And so finding ways to figure out not just what the church wants, or not what the church, how the church wants to receive those gifts, but what do your donors want? How do they want to engage with you, and how do they want to invest in your ministries, whether that's annual pledging or not? One thing I didn't talk about is in most of our churches, 30 to 50% of membership gives nothing. Right. And so, it used to be that we had a 90-10, or we used an 80-20 split, where 80% of the resources came from 20% of the people. We now have a 90-10 split in a lot of congregations. And so, that 10% who's giving 90% really have said, we want to support this. We want to heavily invest in that, because where your treasure is, your heart will also be. So we need to make sure that those people that have said to us, we want to invest heavily in your ministry, we know their heart is with us, and we need to build those relationships to continue to treat them as they should be treated, as family.
Thank you, Christine.
And if I could say one more thing, because I think that the donor-centered nature of what Christine has been talking about is so key. And it's not on our timeline, it's on our donors' timeline. And we've cultivated that through relationships. Mm-hmm. With thinking about that big vision, and there may be a time when someone needs to sell a company or make a gift, and it's not on your timeline. But what are those projects? In your desk drawer, in the second desk drawer, that you can pull out and say, and again, maybe not make it in the ask, but you can drop in a sermon. And one of my mentors used to be so good at sort of saying, if we had $200,000, we could do something with this program. And then sometimes that caught the imagination or attention of someone who wouldn't normally be that regular donor, and they got a check. So just thinking about what dropping in some of those imagination types of projects, wishes, dreams, sowing seeds. This is what this work is, to use those biblical metaphors. And I think, again, sort of tying that into the more systematic approach of your stewardship and fundraising is important, because it is on the timeline, capturing that connection of your donors.
Thanks, David. David, Christine, thank you so much. This is always, it's always a pleasure to be with you both, and I always learn so much. As a reminder, again, this has been recorded, so this will be available later on. The slides will be available. I know we had a little bit of a glitch with getting through some of those, so that'll be available to you on the Whova page of this session. Christine and David's contact information is on the presentation, so feel free to follow up with any questions with them there. Thank you again so much. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.